Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're starting a new series called Public Land Beating the Odds, where we dig back into strategies, mindsets, and approaches to be successful on public land despite the many challenges that come with it. People have been asking for more public land content after our series last year, so here we go. I'm joined this week for part one with Jared Scheffler of Whitetail Adrenaline, who is very well known for his aggressive approach to public land hunting and his raw documentation of it on his DVD series. It's a great conversation aimed at beginners, but will really benefit anyone listening who hunts public land or is thinking about it. And yes, we have our free journal you can download below that will really help you get the most out of this podcast, so check that out. Okay, so here are the top things to look for during this episode. What did Jared struggle with initially when starting public land hunting, and what would he tell others who are just starting out? What does he mean by playing defense and playing offense when hunting? And how does this specifically relate to the right approach for public land? What does Jared mean and refer to as bear holes versus rabbit holes, and why is this concept so important? What was his two big aha moments in public land hunting that helped propel him to where he is today? And there's a whole lot more good stuff in there as usual, so let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. Okay, I'm here with Jared Scheffler. Jared, welcome to the Deer IQ podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great. It's great having you on. We had a little snafu there, but it worked out. And yeah, I've been looking forward to this podcast and chatting with you. We're in a series looking at public land hunting. It's really popular right now for a lot of reasons. One probably being you, honestly, and just the style of hunting you do. Yeah, and Jared's from Whitetail Adrenaline. If you haven't heard of it, I have a hard time thinking that most guys wouldn't know who you are, right? But before we jump into a bunch of questions for you and talking about public land strategies and all that stuff, if in the odd chance someone isn't familiar with you, why don't we start with just tell us a little bit about you and your background, how you got into, I guess, this style of hunting that you do, and just, I guess, what you feel is important for people to kind of know about you.
Sure. So I own Whitetail Adrenaline, which has been producing do-it-yourself DVDs, digital video discs, since 2007. And most of the series is all public land. Seasons 2 through 13 are all public. The first one was a partial, some public, some by permission. And then the latest Uncuffed is mostly public with a little slice of door knocking. So that's the background a bit on the DVD series. As far as my hunting experience, growing up, my dad I'd hear hunting stories from him, and I grew up on a small farm, and he'd take me out hunting, and it was a pretty, I'd say, aggressive type approach looking back on it, compared to, in Wisconsin, legal age was 12 to start hunting.
Right.
And never once did my dad take me out with a tree stand that I ever remember. And I never seen my dad use a tree stand. But most of the time we were elevated. It was just get up that tree over there. You think you can climb up and get in that crotch right there?
Yeah,
and,
okay.
That's, it wasn't usually on the ground so much with a bow. Now gun was primarily, but, and it was a pretty aggressive gun approach. Then around my late teens, as boys get older, they kind of want to go do their own thing a little bit. And there's just kind of that natural, I'm going to figure things out. And I kind of went away from that aggressive style for a period of 4 to 5 years, not entirely. But the bulk of my hunting was more laid back, stationary, calculated, pre-calculated, I guess, more or less approach, if that kind of makes sense. Mm-hmm. What would probably be known as more mainstream hunting methods for private land that work really well on private land, say 15, 20 years ago. And a lot of those strategies still work really well and have further been fine-tuned over the last 20 years to really optimize certain types of hunting settings. Whereas I kind of grew bored of some of the I was hunting some private. I still hunted public in there, and the bulk of what I grew up hunting was public or knock on door. I mean, we never paid to hunt somewhere or had exclusive rights. So I around 22, 23 years of age, I went back to more of the aggressive style and more public land. And in fact, when I was 22, that was the last season that I hunted private. I had gotten some pretty good ground. A lot of other guys could hunt there, but it was good ground. And I over a few years, I just kind of lost there wasn't much adventure left. I mean, it was great that the farmer let me hunt there and there was great deer there, but I kind of checked out on it. So that's a little bit about that.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you kind of grew up with a little bit of a different approach as far as, like you said, your private land stuff. And really, so now you're more like this very run and gun, I guess you'd call it, type approach to public land. Is that a good, I guess, description where you're not sitting in tree stands, right?
Yeah, and not that you can't run and gun with tree stands. I mean, right. I did when I did go down that tree stand road for about 4 or 5 years, and I interlaced some hunting on the ground in there too. But I was running 10-pound stands and usually up and down new locations going in before dark or before light and hanging them in the dark as quiet as I could. And if, it wasn't very eventful, and most of the time, a lot of times there was an adjustment to be made after. So rip the stands down, maybe you move them 50 yards, maybe you completely abandon. I mean, that's a run and gun style within that. But yes, for the most part, it's pretty wild.
Yeah. So how would you describe how you hunt now, though, for maybe guys that have or have not seen your videos? Like, how is that different? Because I'd say a majority of guys are what you're saying there, even on public land. And so you contrasted, private versus public. And I'd agree with that, where private is a lot of times very much like, okay, here's my stand spots. I go in and hunt these, right?
Yeah.
Even within that, maybe they get a little bit aggressive and start bouncing around with a mobile set, let's say.
Yeah.
But you're pretty limited, and it's very a slow, strategic approach, I'd say.
Yes, and that approach I think makes a lot more sense on private ground, and not necessarily just private ground, just ground where pressure is a lot more regulated.
Yeah,
because you're playing more of a tactical game of trying to not blow either the big buck or the herd out,
right.
And your time is on your side, and whereas on a public land setting, time is not always on your side. Although we have had hunts where we've been on, say early season, and in a state where maybe, or an area where maybe there isn't much pressure yet, and we can kind of feel it. We got some time, and we'll play the cards a little bit differently and play a little bit more tactical. Our approach is still pretty aggressive on the ground, but we might, if we sense we've got a few days of, and pressure isn't really climbing and we're not seeing much of that, we might fall back into that, so it's, I don't want to draw a hard line between private and public as far as that's the difference. It's really the difference of the pressure, and then you play your cards a little differently, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense, because the outlier there, the variable is other hunters, right?
Yeah.
And public land, you don't know what's going to happen, right? And I hunt a lot of public land here in Michigan. And that's it. You're constantly trying to get a gauge on the other hunters. If you are aware of some deer or a deer, and it's like, okay, how do I balance this to where I don't blow it out by being stupid and maybe being too aggressive, but at the same time, like tomorrow somebody might just
Yeah.
totally jump in here, and it's like it's quite a fine line you have to dance.
Right. And each situation and scenario, you dance it a little bit differently because there's a little different.
Yeah.
There's different elements to and different. I mean, oh, sure, it might be getting pressured some, but all the pressure's over on this portion of it, and I think I got a little bit more time here. But I totally, you're exactly spot on. There's a fine line, and especially you being in Michigan, that line gets even finer.
Yeah, it really does depend on your area and where you're at and everything.
Yeah.
Let's. I want to come back to that dance because I think that's a very intricate thing to discuss, and maybe we. I'm trying to like approach this, into the shallow end to the deep end for maybe guys that haven't started hunting much in public land. So let's go back there. We'll come back to the dance idea, but so your story is, I think, really interesting, and I want to kind of draw from your experience and kind of related to guys just getting into or this struggle with the public land hunting stuff. So for a person just starting out or that struggles with public land hunting, maybe it's just new to them or they have a new area, what are some top things that maybe you struggled with getting into it, and maybe some lessons you learned that you'd say, oh, if I go back 10 years, I'd tell myself this, or for a new guy, this, look out for these two things, or whatever it is that are, I guess, barriers maybe, or points they might struggle.
Sure. I got a couple points on that. The first I'll say is I was pretty fortunate in what I learned from my dad before I was ever 12. He had me pretty on point with playing defense. So there was a lot of hunting pressure in Wisconsin where I grew up around this big public land area. It was kind of wedged between two pretty decent sized cities. So I was already pretty, I guess you'd say, programmed and conditioned to play the defense game and really understand how pressure affects deer before I was even of age of 12. Mm-hmm. Whereas a new person just starting to get into hunting that maybe didn't have that, you got to go through the ropes a little bit more. But, when you're hunting public land, it is a defense offense. Maybe this isn't the best way to put it, but offense is just strictly focused on the hunt that involves me and the animal. The defense part is the other hunters, and that also includes keeping a very low key on what you're doing. I've used tricks before where I put the HUD up on the vehicle because I found a little nugget. And yes, it's public land, but I don't want anybody to think that I'm an actual hunter. And that trick only works one time in that location before it's like, I know what you're up to. And then now you've really drawn in the hunters, because if you're trying to keep it secret, and then, so that's the defense side that somebody new getting in may not understand. And it may take them, a few years to really fine tune and hone in on. So as far as the barriers on the offense side, now that, yes, there's a lot of with hunting knowledge and information and all that, and all the science and what we know and whatnot. Oftentimes with that comes rules or barriers or limitations. For the most part, the style that I've found to be most successful is kind of breaking a lot of those, but you kind of have to at different times. There's a, I don't want to call it a rule, but one thing I used to do way back in the day is I'd get a location or get a beat on a big one. I didn't get them killed that day. But then I'd go too slow, try to calculate in there. And then in 2-3 days, he's no longer around. And I kind of started to put some connecting dots there. And I was like, it's not because I blew it out, because I'm not going in there after I'd see the visual from 200 yards out or whatever, and I'd sneak my way out, and I wouldn't go in there again, and I'd watch my route on how I went in and be really calculated. And it wasn't so much me going in there and like, trampling it all up or whatever. It was just that animal, they're fairly nomadic at times unless the environment's completely controlled with their food, water, dose supply, and all those things, and hunting pressure. So kind of breaking down those rules a little bit, like that work oftentimes really good in those private land settings. Whereas it's more like now if I get a beat on a big one, unless it's like early season and the conditions are right, most of the time, even if it seems about impossible for me to sneak in there on them in the situation, that's what I'm going to try, because maybe I've only got a 10% chance, but I got them right now in my sights, like if I could just slip in there. And in the beginning of doing this, the failure rate's higher in there, to where you get enough experience, and that 10% now maybe turns into 30, 40, 50%, you're going to pull it off because you've got enough experience from actually doing it and putting yourself in those hairy situations that you've worked out a lot of the kinks. Not always. I mean, the video series that we produce clearly shows that the kinks aren't always worked out, even though we've been doing it a long time. And that's one thing I really like about the series and keeping it what it is even though we've been doing it a long time, we still show it, the mishaps and all the screw ups along the way. So
yeah, kind of the difference, and I think people like this, is unlike a standard TV show where, at the end of the half hour you always shoot the big buck, or they always somehow do. It's just like, yeah, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. That's real life, But yeah, I think that's a good analogy, the defense offense. And there's a lot of defense on public land. Like, I think I've seen a episode. I haven't seen all your videos, but I think I saw one of your early ones where you did the car at the side of the road, the old junker car.
Yeah.
And so you're saying you don't have a truck with your whitetail adrenaline plastered all over the side?
I do not.
To advertise? Yeah, that'd probably be counterproductive.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually put a decal of whitetail adrenaline on my vehicle. So
put it on somebody else's vehicle.
yeah. One of my guys, Scott, did for a little while, but the first trip of the year, we ripped it off quick day one. So.
Yeah, it's got to be low key, definitely. And I've had, because public land gets so weird. I've had, other hunters, if they're local or like can get real territorial, so you're working around them and trying to deal with them. And then I've had private land hunters where you're next to private land that'll literally, try to mess up your hunts if they know that you're hunting somewhere. So then you got to be sneaky about where you're parking and stuff. And so there's all this, that's the defense you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Is all that added stuff that shouldn't be an issue when you're hunting private. So that's an added element there.
The territorialness, that's pretty natural in mankind when they invest time and effort into something, whether it's good or bad. It doesn't matter if they've invested time and energy into it, then they get to territorial towards it, and they get protective of it. And it's, you could take really bad scenarios of really, what you'd call evil, but stuff, and that if they've worked hard to get that, they'll that's theirs in their mind.
Right. Yeah. And I've run into that a lot. And I think the antidote of that is kind of what you're doing is, okay, I'll just go somewhere else. Right. If you only have one spot, and I guess I'd say this to guys out there listening, like you got to have a ton of spots or potential or hold stuff loosely, in your hands. Like, okay,
that's a good way to put it. Hold it loose. Yeah.
Because I may or may not get this, I'm just going to move on. You don't invest too much expectation in a particular spot or deer.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's when things get crazy. Yeah. But
yes. And what you said there, years ago, I forget how I used to say that. on different podcasts, but basically treat each day as its own. That's what it was. Treat each day as its own. Like if you get into a spot and it's, or a pocket or whatever, and it's really good, and then you come back the next day, and after a little time, if you don't feel it, we learned burn out of there and go try to find the next hot spot. Yesterday it was there, and then maybe in 2 days we pop back in, and sometimes it's back to, it could be dependent on so many variables besides just hunting pressure. It could have been just a high wind day coming in from a certain direction, all kinds of, different variables in there. We don't need to go down all the rabbit holes of the different variables, but for some reason, and I also kind of learned to not invest too much time dissecting why it went cold between yesterday and today, rather than invest a lot of time to dissect that. Maybe evaluate it a little bit, but I'm better spent focusing energy and effort trying to find the next hot pocket for the rest of the day.
Gotcha. So it's a very aggressive approach, I would say, as to how you go at it, and not sitting back. And I think that is a big one that is different between private and public that I've struggled with before, right? You get really analytical and, trying to figure all this stuff out, and you're basically saying, okay, if you find a hot spot, go in and give it your best shot. And that is true that if you have never done something, you're probably not going to be very good at it, so it takes some repetition, not only the knowledge part. You can listen to a lot of podcasts now and watch a lot of videos and get some knowledge, but you still have to apply it and see how it works out in the field. Right. And over time, you're going to start and you'll be moderately successful, but over time, those little nuances, you start figuring those out, right?
Right. Yeah. I break knowledge and knowing is two completely separate entities. Knowledge is just, we're having a conversation here, and let's say I'm a new hunter, or what I'm hearing here, I am picking up as new information. I don't have the knowing yet. Yeah. The knowing doesn't formulate until after I've taken that knowledge or possible knowledge, applied it, and found out for my own self whether this works or works for me, and get some experience. That's when the knowing comes, and that's how I kind of define it, I guess. And that's, you get enough of that, then you have competence in what, right. I've come across, individuals at times that they absorb a lot of knowledge, which is listening, reading, but haven't yet implemented it and cross the threshold into the knowing. And then they oftentimes are speaking as if what they heard is factual and right. But they don't know all the ins and outs of it. So that's kind of how I usually try to break that down. And what you kind of said, analytical, I'm an extremely analytical person. So I had to kind of, what I would want to do by nature of who I am is sit there and absorb, okay, why are the deer not in here today? And, I do that, and I really try to not spend a lot of time doing that. I'll do it for a little bit and but then shift into, okay, that's not going to help me too much moving forward for the rest of my day. Where are they at now, or what, so if that kind of makes sense.
It does. I think knowing your personality is important, because if we're similar, we're analyzers, right? So that can lead to paralysis. If you're on that end of the spectrum, like then you don't ever do anything, right? And you're always a step or two behind taking the action you probably should. So I always think it's important to try to figure out the why, because then you're not going to learn for the next time, right? So if I screw up a hunt, okay, so what happened here? Why did this happen? How can I do better next time? I think that's good. But yeah, if knowing your personality, if you're like that analyzer, you can probably tone that back a bit, because it's going to inhibit you. Whereas if you never think about it at all, and you're just bouncing from here to there, and you never think about what happened and try to figure some things out, maybe you should a little more type thing.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that's that fine line again.
Yeah.
You want to dissect it and analyze it just enough to get what you need out of it, so you
Move on.
advance, and so you kind of have some understanding. You brought up a point there. It's kind of like, something goes wrong out in the field. Okay, let's just say I'm sneaking in on a big buck, and the wind's real touchy.
Okay, so here is your high IQ moment. Do you consider both the offense and defense part of public land hunting? How much effort or focus do you spend on each? It's important, as Jared said, to realize that both go on in public land hunting, and that's just part of it. I've experienced myself that if I spend all my time on offense, just focused on me and the deer, and don't consider the real part of defense, the other hunters involved and how they change the game, that I will get very frustrated. It's important to realize that other hunters are part of the equation and that I need to spend some of my efforts in that area. How do I avoid them, and how do I hunt deer reacting to them? Keeping expectations real is a big part of being able to beat the odds when public land hunting, and is something to think about. And if you want a detailed guide with 8 new approaches to beat the odds and the crowds on public land, check out our free public land hunting guide linked below. It's compiled from many of our expert guests from this show and some things I've had success with over the years as well. It's a big help, and you can find that again linked below. And also check out the Deer IQ services we offer, including private land plans, getting a Deer IQ test and consultation, and our newly announced weekend whitetail workshop, now taking pre-registrations. Details are below for all of those. Okay, and now let's get back to the podcast.
Something goes wrong out in the field. Okay, let's just say I'm sneaking in on a big buck, and the wind's real touchy, and I got to cheat this wind just really tight to make this work. And at the last second, I get a little wind in the back of my neck. It kicks to the deer in a matter of a couple, 3 seconds, and it's over. He's got me. Yeah, I can sit there and I've done this, like that damn wind. It's
the wind's fault.
But really the proper, once you get over, like, yeah, it was the wind's fault, but I probably cut it a little too tight, and right. So you take that little bit of knowledge, and you're like, you get into a situation, maybe it's later that year, maybe it's the next year, and it's similar situation, and maybe I'm just going to stay 2 yards more this direction. If I get 5 yards over here, it's not going to work because he's got an eyeball where he can see me, but maybe I won't thread that needle quite as tight, so that's the dissection and what you kind of talked about, that I think is a healthy, there's a line there.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Good to think about. So as a guy just getting into it, let's say, is there any, I'd like to know if there was an aha moment for you, like toward the beginning, where like, oh, wow, it totally changed your mindset. But also before that though, so guys just getting into it, are there a couple of things, let's say I'm totally green, like, okay, I've heard about this public land stuff. Maybe I got booted from some private. Now I don't have anything, right? So I'm going to get into it. Not sure where to start. Are there like a couple like low-hanging fruit items that would help people the most? Like, okay, focus on these 2 things or this one thing first that'll just help you the most.
Yeah, I'd say in most states, public land is fairly pressured. And so I generally like to look at public land, like 90% of public is not worth my time, or 95% of it is not worth my time to invest a lot of time in. So I cover a lot of ground with the mentality of not so much trying to find a hot pocket, but more or less eliminating the acreage. Like, okay, this is getting pressured. This is, there's not good crop out there. And at this time of the year, I don't really get the feeling that they're going to be using that or whatever. You're taking in all the, and I'm basically just eliminating acreage. And by default, then you hone in on those pockets a little bit more, and you don't spend days and weeks. You're trying to make educated guesses on, and out of the gate, it's a little more challenging to maybe know what the signs are that, okay, I shouldn't invest much time here or any time here on this particular piece of public or this part of this public. But really, that's probably the biggest one right there. And so you got rabbit holes and you got bear holes. Okay. Now, if you're putting dirt in holes, you want to put dirt in the bear holes first, right? Before you go down the road of putting dirt in the rabbit holes. So a bear hole would be, I'm not very good at eliminating acreage or dissecting acreage that's worth my time versus not. That would be what I'd call the leading bear hole that I would want to put dirt in. If you put a lot of dirt in that hole and you get really good at that, you're gonna do well on getting on more good caliber deer or deer period, if you focus on that. And then as you go down the road, you can kind of fine tune more on the rabbit hole side of things, as far as all those tiny little micro details of what I was kind of talking about earlier, like cutting the wind and all that. You're going to learn. I guess what I'm trying to say there is sometimes people get hung up on a lot of small details of things, and they haven't put dirt very well in the big holes. That it's the 80-20 rule principle.
Yeah. No, I get it.
And so having kind of a broken down list of like, what do I need to get really good at first? What makes sense? Order of importance. Well, eliminating a lot of public land acreage is going to put you on a lot more deer, which if you're able to do that and get on a lot more deer, you're able to get a lot more experience in those situations with deer where you're going to run into a lot of those micro detail rabbit hole issues of, I should not have cut the wind that tight quite that much. I should not have stepped like this. I should not have picked this route to go in, all those tiny little ones. But if you're focused too much on all those before you're even covering I'm not very explaining that very well, but I think you get what I'm putting down.
I get it. Yeah, no, it does make a lot of sense. I think a lot of guys do, and they can get stuck in this trap for years and years and never get out of it because they don't understand it or don't know. So this could apply to anybody, really. But if you're so hung up on the little nuances, and this is where I think it's tough with, you talk about the guy that knows everything because they've read all the articles, listened to all the podcasts. That's kind of where they're stuck. They're focused on these little nuancy things, and they're missing the big picture of, hey, you just need to figure out where the deer are first. Yeah. And that is the biggest piece of the pie that then allows you to, focus on these nuancy things of your hunt. Yeah. But if you can't get there, those little things don't matter. Right.
It's not that those little things shouldn't. Like they're very good to put to get right, but not before the big things.
Right. No, that's a good explanation. That's a good explanation.
I mean, I've got things over the last few years I've really honed in on. I haven't gotten out into the field very much, but it's something I've been chasing for a long time in archery that will make things go much more smoothly for me when I get in tight on them. And that's a different area, but it was really holding me back in the field on different scenarios. So that's kind of an evaluation on, okay, well, I'm usually pretty good on getting in pretty tight on big
Right.
bucks, but that's when things get really wild too, and things happen fast, and unexpected things happen, and I'm at the mercy of some different things on the bow and arrow side that are really handicapping me and holding me back. And so we don't need to talk about all that, but yes,
Yeah.
that's some other things that for my own self, I knew it for over a decade. It's just very hard to put dirt in some of those holes.
Yeah.
So.
It's a continual process, but focusing on the big things first, and that's a huge one.
Right.
Yeah, so as we wrap up this segment here, Jared, do you have a story? I asked about an aha moment, or just a story where some of these things maybe crystallized to you and you're like, oh, wow. Do you have one of those you can remember in your progression as a hunter?
Yeah, I've got some. I'll maybe do two here and I'll try to keep them both short. The first year we produced the videos, we're running around with a bigger camera, and we did that first video. We did the first three videos are some ground, some tree stand stuff too. And let's see, I killed one or two on the ground that first season. But the second season, we were still playing the 10-pound tree stand game that I had kind of molded into. And we decided to climb down. I'll skip a bunch of the details here. We had decided to climb down. We went into this piece of public, hadn't been in there before, decided to climb down. We hung the tree stands, sat there an hour. Not much was happening, and I got bored. So let's climb down and just kind of snoop around. Maybe we'll spot one. Maybe we'll learn a little bit more about this piece. It had a good feel to it. The overall piece did. It was quite a trek back into this spot. And we didn't go very far, probably only 20 minutes worth. It was maybe 100 yards. We were slow stepping, still hunting, I guess you'd call it. And I spotted a big buck, one that I'd be happy with. Well, about 5 hours later, and a lot of navigating of satellite bucks and rerouting and completely losing our visual and coming in at different angles. And then I think, if my memory is right, we had to back out and come in again because too many satellite bucks moved in like this. We finally threaded the needle enough that I shot this big buck, and the footage was really good for 2008 of what we had there. And people loved that hunt. And, hunting deer solo on the ground isn't as difficult as a second guy with a big camera and capture and all that. And I guess on the filming standpoint, that was a little bit more of an aha moment of, we did it. It was hairy. I think there were 7 satellite bucks. It was a pretty open woods. So it wasn't like a lot. It wasn't, grass or whatever. I mean, it was, but we did it, and we filmed it, and the footage was great. And so that was kind of like a bit of a aha moment of, yeah, we can probably do this more often. So on that front. Now, on another front, it was probably about 5 years into doing the videos. We were running what I'd call pretty wild by then, as far as our style, and everything was getting more and more aggressive, and more we were adapting on the fly, and we started to really get a lot more results. In fact, the second thing, I'm going to back up a bit. When I talked about the big holes to put dirt in, I'd say the cover and ground is the first one in eliminating that acreage. The second one is developing a very aggressive, adaptable style, hunting style. Whether you use saddles, tree stands, you're hunting on the ground, that in and out and adapting on the fly very aggressively, that's, I think, the second one to get really good at and really conditioned to, as far as on a public land setting, that's going to really help you out and get you on a lot more deer. And it kind of ties in with eliminating acreage too, because if you have that aggressive style, you're reading it, boom, I'm in and out. But it was about 5 seasons in, and I was reflecting back, and I'm like, man, this has been about 2-3 years that it's like we're not as dependent on whether we're going to have a good season by acorn crop and whether the rut's good or not good or whatnot. The general topic that you'd hear a lot of times in the hunting space, oh, it wasn't a good rut, or this was, we were still getting a high encounter rate. And so that's when I kind of reflected back, and I'm like, okay, our style's gotten very aggressive. We're in and out of places very efficiently and very quickly. We're eliminating acreage. We're not getting emotionally attached to deer or pieces. So that was kind of an aha moment, the emotional attachment side. And what we kind of talked about a little bit earlier is investing very much time into a deer or a piece or a location does generally instill an emotional attachment to where
it does.
It's a comfort. We've been there. We kind of know we found this sign from last year, and that a lot of that stuff can help put you ahead too, but it can also hurt you if everything's changed by the following year versus. So that's why kind of what I had mentioned earlier, treat each day as its own. Like, it can shift on a dime. And often does. So that's where that adaptable, mobile approach can adapt much quicker and much more efficiently with that change. So yeah, there was some aha moments. So there's, I guess, a couple of them.
Yeah, those are big ones. Thanks for sharing that. I'm sure there's a ton along the way of all these little things that you're always picking up and saying, okay, yeah, this is working, this isn't. But yeah, those are big ones. Yeah. So thanks, Jared, for joining us here. Yeah. We're gonna continue in segment 2, and I think we're gonna dive into the 2 things you just talked about and get more detailed about those. But for this episode, thanks, Jared, for coming on. The guys are going to get a lot out of this, so I appreciate it.
You bet.
Okay, so here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. Consider the bear holes and the rabbit holes in your hunting and which ones are taking your attention. Are these things you should be focusing on, or are there bigger things that need your time? And if you want an objective assessment of these blind spots we all have that hamstring us, take our new Deer IQ test and find those out for sure. And next time we continue with public land, looking at some big myths you absolutely need to bust to have success. You won't want to miss it, and I'll see you then.